Hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors. And if that's news to you, if you're a guest here, hey, it's good to have you with us. It's really good to have you with us. Aren't you glad we're not having the church picnic today? We had like the most perfect picnic weather last week, and I want to just say thanks to the team that put that together. What a great picnic we had. And guests, it's great to have you here. If you stick around for a year, we're going to have another picnic, so there's that. Hey, I want to just take a moment here to talk to sort of the home team, the people that are part of this church, who love this church, who care about the future of this church and the well-being of this church, and just kind of give you a little update on our finances. Now, if you're our guest here, I'm not even talking to you. Just get out your iPhone, get something straightened out with an aunt or something like that, or Facebook, or whatever you want to do. I'll be back to you in just a minute, okay? But home team, people of this church, let me talk to you, okay? This is the end of our fiscal year. We're halfway through July. Our fiscal year, our financial year ends at the end of July. And there's a lot of good news to talk about this year. Last year, if you remember, was sort of our emergency year. We had a little season there around March where I said, got to pay attention. Something's going wrong here. Everybody just rallied. There was like a big rally to the cause. And with some giving and also some belt tightening and everything, we finished the year well. I want to say this year has been very similar financially without all that rallying. Like the general giving has done better. The giving per person is up, and we're about the same without all the rallying going on, except for last year. At this point, 2 weeks from the end, we were 18,000 in the hole, and this year we're 17,000. No, that's not right. Yes, that's right. Right? No, it can't be. Huh? Is it 100 or 1,000? Tell me right now. Okay, never mind. Kathy, is it 100 or are we 18,000 last year in the hole, or 1,800 in the hole last year at this time? 18,000. Okay. Okay, great. So this is going to be on the video for sure. Okay, hi everybody. It just seemed, it seemed like too much to say, that much of a change, but well done, guys. Well done on all things. 18,000 last year, that's what I have written on my paper, but it just made me feel weird while I was saying it. I'm not a numbers guy, okay? So we were down 18,000 last year. We're up 17,000 this year going in. So really great news. It's fantastic. We're doing well. There's 2 more weeks. If you want to change that number even better, do it. Do it. We're going to finish really, really well this year. But I do want to say there's still some room to grow. There's things that we've got to do to grow as a church, because one of the things that we are trying to do is do more. We're trying to plant churches. We're paying attention. Amy Ross is seeking God. Hey, what do you want to do in my life? We're going to plant a church with her. Jared's got it in his heart to plant a church. This September, we're going to be part of planting a church in Princeton, New Jersey. We're restarting Alpha in our church. We, for the first time, have a full-time children's ministry. And of course, all this stuff is stuff that we're going to have to support financially. The way you spend your money is what you show is important in your heart. And I just want to encourage you to get on board. Now, we've got some people who are giving very, very faithfully. We've got other people who are here. They're just checking out, like, what is church? What is Jesus? And look, I'm not talking to either of those groups, but I want to talk to that middle group. It's time to get on board. This is the best thing you're going to do with your life. We are the conduit for the gospel in this world. And I just want to let you know, we've got our support base in our church, we saw on that survey, is about 50% of the church. Like 50% of the people give to make that happen, what's happening. And there's another kind of a group of people who are just checking it out, great. But they're somewhere in the middle. Is some people that just go like, hey, I love coming here. And I want to call you into this. Let's do this together. There's so much more that we could do if everybody worked together. And I really want to call you to kind of make a decision now as we're going into the new financial year, or if you haven't given this year, to really end the year strong. And let's build together. And also, let's see if we can get a pastor that's better with numbers. All right. I was just freaking out a little bit because I didn't believe my own handwriting. Here we go. We're going to look at a super interesting story today. I am going to cover 14 chapters of the Bible. So I don't know what you have planned for the afternoon, but if you just cancel it right now. Here we go. I want to show you Genesis 37. We'll just read a portion of this. And this is a fascinating story. It is the beginning of the story, the end of Genesis, I don't know, from 37 to 50, is all about the life of this guy named Joseph, like Joseph in the Technicolor coat, that Joseph. Let's read. Jacob lived in a land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending his flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah. His family system's a little convoluted with 2 wives, a bunch of concubines, okay, and all the sons that come out of that. He brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because they had been born to him in his old age. He made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and couldn't speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We're binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will my mother and I and will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now the brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brother and with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." And he headed off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing? They've moved from here. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams." And when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life. Let's not shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." And Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off his robe and the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. And the camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" Like his point is, we're going to lose money out of this deal. "Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, the brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the cistern, he saw Joseph wasn't there. He tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers, said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And then they got Joseph's robe. And they slaughtered a goat, and they dipped it in the robe in blood. And they took the ornate robe back to the father, and they said, "We found this. Examine it and see whether it's your son's robe." Jerks. That's not in there. My translation. I've read this 3 times now. It's terrible. Right? He recognized it, and he said, "This is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal devoured him. Joseph's been surely torn to pieces." And when Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, and he mourned his son many days, and all of his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No, I'll continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." And so his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt, to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Let's pray together. Well, I'm aware that as I go to preach this, there's people here who have very painful family histories. And this kind of reminds you that you were abused as a kid, or that something terrible happened between you and your siblings, or you and your parents. And I pray for God's mercy on your life. I pray for comfort from the scripture and hope and some kind of handle to grab onto and pull yourself up in the preaching today. And also, many of us would just say thank you for the very stable people in our family, the people who made our family a safe place and a good place and a place of edification where this kind of stuff wasn't tolerated. And we thank you, Lord, for mature people. And some of us in here would like to say, make me mature so, Lord, I could be a resource for my family. And we ask this in Jesus' name. So here's the deal. What we're trying to do is we're trying to talk about Christ-like relationships. We're trying to grow in maturity. The Christian doesn't talk too much about perfection. The Christian talks about maturing, okay? So it's not like flawless perfection, but we're trying to grow into the fullness of everything that God has for us. And God's got a plan for you that's to grow you into all that you can be and to make you like Jesus. Jesus is a great picture of how God is, but Jesus is a great picture of how a human being who's whole is. And so Jesus is the Lord's trying to grow us into that. And Joseph is a beautiful, beautiful picture. In fact, there's hardly anything wrong with Joseph. In fact, when people preach about this, they sort of have to strain to find something wrong with Jesus. Now, we do find out in the first line here that Joseph was a tattletale, okay? So he does give the father a bad report about his brothers, but honestly, he's 17 years old. And if you could say this about Joseph, he sort of tells on his brothers. And also, when he has a dream from God, he just sort of spouts it out. So that's what people say, oh, he's so proud. He's just saying, I had this dream from God, or he's foolishly telling it to the brothers. You shouldn't have done that. Listen, if this is the worst that your 17-year-old does, okay, we'll take it, right? Okay? All three of my 17-year-olds were worse than that, okay? Especially that one, right? Okay? And you know what? Listen. This is not so bad. This is not really anything. It's hardly even a point, because especially when you contrast it with this dysfunctional family that this guy is from. Before this story, we find out that the brothers are murderers, taking vengeance on far more people than ever. Some people have wronged their sister. They take vengeance on a whole village and kill all the men of that village. They're bloodthirsty. We know that they're greedy when they think, oh, let's not kill him. Let's get some money for him, right? So, whatever your little brother does, did you ever think we should kill him? I know you might have thought that, but did you ever do it? No, you didn't do it, right? They're making legitimate plans. Let's kill this dreamer. They squash his dreams. They're murderous. They're self-righteous at one point. They're just looking at themselves in the right. They're fully willing to feel put out by the father's love for his son, right? They're envious of him. They're devious. They're willing to be cruel to their father. They say to the father, oh, look, is this by any chance Joseph's robe? It looks kind of like that robe you gave Joseph, right? They're willing to see their father suffer. These are bad guys. And by the way, isn't it cool how God chooses the bad ones, right? These are the 12 tribes of Israel, right? The names of these brothers are the tribes that come out, the 12 tribes of Israel. This is where we get them. And these are the people who are surrounding Joseph. Joseph comes out of this in some kind of beautiful way. And the real big question underlining the whole sermon is, how does a kid come out of this like this? We're talking about Joseph in his teenage years. So he's 17 years old when all this happens to him. And he has these two dreams, which, by the way, are just so beautiful. One's of kind of an agricultural dream. One's an astrological dream, right? There's sheaves bowing down. There's stars, there's sun, there's moon. And they both indicate that at the very center, Joseph is going to be an important person to whom the rest of the family bows down. And the family picks right up on the interpretation right away. And they're totally against the interpretation. They're offended by it. The father does say he keeps it in mind, but he actually is not strong in defending Joseph to the other brothers. And it's just like a sick family. Like there's nothing about this family that I would wish on you. There's nothing about this that I would want except maybe that God would speak to your family. I really believe that God speaks in dreams. I've actually had it happen several times in my life that I know of, maybe more and I wasn't paying attention, but I just have several situations that a dream has come to me and I felt this is like a message from God for me. And I know he does it because he does it for me. I mean, I've actually had a couple dreams, and I think if you're thinking you'd like this to happen, it would be great for you to pray. I remember once when I was a brand new Christian, I was sort of curious about all this stuff. I was totally interested in going for it. As a young 21-year-old, I gave my life to the Lord, and I was all the way in. I just wanted, now I had a lot of learning, a lot of kind of course correction, rough edges to work off, and sin to submit to God, and it took years for that to happen. But really, right at the beginning, I was so interested. God, what are you doing? And the church that I was a part of, the church that Barb grew up in, was a church where two different pastors had ended their time as pastors by moral failures. And the whole church was like a shambles. Like, it's so confusing and everything. And we hired this guy who was as different from me as you could possibly be. He was old and well-dressed. He's sort of like just this wise Mr. Rogers kind of guy. You know, and I'm just some long-haired soccer-playing artist guy. And I just sort of loud and brash. And let's go, you know, come on, we got to go. And this guy spoke quietly. And I was just kind of, well, what is this guy? Like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to relate to him. And the Lord came to me in a dream, and he went to the front of a church. Our whole church was in commotion. And he sat down in a chair in a very, very peaceful way, and he just spoke. And the whole church hushed. And the Lord said to me, this guy speaks for me, and you should listen to him. And I did over the years. His name was C. Glenn Orr. And he made a great impact on me. What does it mean to be a mature grandfather? When I say he was old, what I mean is he's about how old I am now. But the Lord just spoke to me in a way like, listen to this guy. This guy has something to offer you. And by the way, I just want to say to the teenagers in the room, these years are meant for dreaming. And there'll be people like the brothers here that will try to squash your dreams. These are years where you think very big thoughts about what could be and how you might grow up and what God has for you. And he may even speak them to you in a dream or different ways. But I want you to pay attention to those. I want the teenagers of our church to say, God, what do you have for me? What's the big thing that you have for me? And not to be limited, because the world will keep trying to like shuffle you down into some little slot. Just get there and earn your check and go home at the end of you just be like a nice person. There's so much more for you. And God spoke to Joseph in those days, and I think what he said to him in those days was something that shaped the rest of his life. But if that's how it was when he was a teenager, the next time we find out an age of Joseph is when he's 30 years old in chapter 41. He enters into the throne room of Pharaoh, and he has kind of a huge future ahead of him. But I just want to point out to you, this is like the marking place at the end of a ton of suffering. The 20s of Joseph, his 20 years, from the time he's 17 to when he's 29, are very difficult years for him. And one of the things I want to say about that is, it's important to think that, hey, if God has something for you, that doesn't mean those dreams are going to go like fix your life, or the purpose of God or the plans of God or the closeness of God or what he has for you just makes everything work. No, in fact, a lot of suffering was Joseph's. He's treated so poorly by the people that are around him, the people that are destined by God or purposed by God to love him, treat him abusively. And some of you come from very, very painful family things. Being with God and being a part of God's plan doesn't mean everything's just going to work. And so we see Joseph go into some very hard years in his 20s, and I want to talk to you about them. Famously, he's sold into the house of this official named Potiphar. And right away, Potiphar notices that the Lord is with him. In 39:3, it says this: when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, he put him in charge of the whole house. So Potiphar says, like, there's something about this kid. You know, he comes in as a slave. He's just bought. He's just one of the slaves. And all of a sudden, the Potiphar sees that the Lord's doing something with Joseph, and he puts him in charge of the whole house. And Joseph takes that really seriously. By the way, throughout these kind of 13 years of his 20s plus the late years in his teens, it's continually said of Joseph, the Lord was with him. And the Lord was with him, and he's going through, if you charted out his life, it would look like boom, 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 good news, bad news, good news, bad news. And it's just a crazy combination of like, wow, if this is what happens when the Lord is with you, what happens when the Lord isn't with you? Because so many bad things happen to him. But when he has any kind of authority, when he has any kind of place at all, when he gets a chance to exercise who he is and what he's for, things happen good. And Potiphar says, look, I'm going to put you in charge of the whole house. And so this very young guy is put in charge of the whole house. And then he has a problem. Potiphar's wife is not faithful to Potiphar and notices, as it says in Genesis, that Joseph was well-built and handsome. And this is a perfect application for this church, filled with people who are good-looking, well-built, right? And you need to pay attention to this part right here. Joseph was well-built and handsome, and Potiphar's wife comes after him and says, come and sleep with me. And Joseph said, there's no way. I've been put in charge of this entire thing. I'm being trusted by your husband to take care of everything, including you. I've been totally trusted. There's no way I could sin against him or against the Lord. He just really refutes the whole thing. And it says, day after day, she comes after him, but he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And it's just a fascinating thing. Listen, part of what happens in your young years as a Christian, as you're in your 20s, is that there's a lot of temptation. There's a lot of opportunity to hop off of those initial commitments that you've made. And I just see Joseph here as this example of saying, no, that wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be right to your husband. It wouldn't be right to the Lord. It's like he can't believe her persistence. He can't believe that she would be part of tempting him. And he keeps refusing her until one day, as he kind of comes close to her, she grabs his robe and tries one more time to seduce him. And he just pulls away, and his robe comes off, and he runs out of the house. And that's why I always say, if I see any of you running past my house naked someday, I'm just going to stand and give you a round of applause. Like, there you go. That's my church running away from sin. Way to go. I just want to just encourage you. So give it a try. Let's see how it goes. But seriously, there are times when you've got to act on your convictions. You've got to act on what you've said. God is with me. God has a plan for me. I just can't give in to this lesser thing because God has something for me. And, of course, this whole thing backfires on him, so it seems. And he is arrested. She cries out rape. She's embarrassed by the whole scene with him running out of the house. She turns around and she says, he tried to rape me, right? And she has him arrested, and Potiphar throws him into jail. And the first thing it says when he's in jail is, and the Lord was with him. And it's just an amazing thing as he's like kind of going into this thing where it's like, wow, abused, possibly going to be murdered by his brothers, lied about his brothers, rejected and sold into slavery by his brothers. Now that doesn't work out. Now he's going into jail, and he's just like suffering because he's part of the plan of God. Or he's part of a world with unredeemed people who aren't paying attention. And one of the things I want to say, if you're in your 20s, this is a time to become the person that God is making you to be. I don't care what happens in your career. I mean, I literally think your 20s are mostly to be about, like, I want to be the person God made me to be. No matter whether I'm in a great situation or a tough situation, I am this kind of person. I tell the truth. I keep my word. I live into the things that God has for me. Esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem to be. Your 20s are about getting to the place where God can use you, where God can trust you with responsibilities. And it is possible. And we want to be helpful in that. We want to really be helpful in our church at helping you grow into this. It's what maturing is all about. And I would just say this to you. You're going to be tested, and you can come out successful. And this is not a message that you're going to hear in a lot of different places in our culture, especially in this sexual area. Like, hey, you can be faithful to God in this area in your 20s. but it's what the Bible offers, and it's what Joseph models for us. And he gets to a place where God is able to use him. When he's 30 years old, he enters into the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. You know how that happens, right? He's in jail, and there's these two guys from Pharaoh's household. They're kind of officials. One bakes for Pharaoh. The other tests the wine of Pharaoh. He's a cupbearer, it's called. And they both get thrown into jail. They get on the wrong side of Pharaoh. Off to jail they go. And Joseph is put in charge of them. Again, he's got some responsibility in the jail. It's kind of amazing what God has for Joseph. Wherever he is, he starts leading. And they have these two dreams. They can't figure out what the dreams mean. One of the dreams means the baker's going to die. The other means the cupbearer is going to live and get freed from prison. Joseph nails the interpretation. He does so by saying, listen, it's the Lord who will give the interpretation. And he knows a little bit about dreams from God, and he interprets it for these guys. And they get set, the one gets set free, and the other gets set free in the worst kind of way. He dies, right? And there's a promise made. The promise is like this, that when I get out of jail, the cupbearer says, I will remember you to Pharaoh. And so when he gets out of jail, he totally forgets him to Pharaoh, okay? Can you imagine that for Joseph? Like, this is amazing. I've had total success in interpreting this guy's dream. Who would have thought that God would have put somebody from Pharaoh's household in prison with me, and I'd be able to serve him so much he's going to remember me? And then a day goes by, and a month goes by, and 2 months go by. And what's it like when you're in there for 2 months or 3 months and no word from Pharaoh, hey, my cupbearer says you're good, the real deal? No, he totally forgets until Pharaoh has a dream, and it's an intense dream. And you can look at all, you should read all of this, okay? Read 37 to 50 in Genesis. It's an incredible story, right? But he has this intense dream, and nobody can interpret it. And then the cupbearer has this like aha moment, like, oh, nuts. I totally forgot Pharaoh. Like, there's this guy in jail. I was going to tell you about him a couple years ago. But he's great with dreams. So they send for Joseph, and they kind of clean him up. And he shaves up like an Egyptian, and he cleans and washes for the first time in years. And he's presented to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him a dream, and he lays out this whole dream, and he actually is like recognized by Pharaoh, and Pharaoh calls him to serve. He says, you're going to be second. Nobody's going to have more power than you. Because this guy has some connection with God. And now all these things that have kind of worked out in the small scale, like this little leadership, is now he's the second most powerful person on the planet, no doubt about it. And he comes into this role, and it's Joseph at 30, moving into maturity, moving into what God has for him. And don't be too bound up in what the numbers are exactly. If you get to be the second most powerful person when you're 32, don't worry about it. God's not slighting you, okay? We all move to what God has for us, but that's what I want for you. I want you to step into, as you move into your 30s, as you move into whatever year you are next, step into being the mature person that God has for you, so that your strengths, your gifting, God's hand on you starts blessing the world around you and the people who are around you. And that's what happens here. He becomes this guy who solves a world problem. The problem is famine, and that's what Pharaoh's dreams were all about. And Joseph, now with some power to act on what God has said in these dreams, does so, and in a very practical way. By the way, most of God's stuff goes like this. There's a spiritual aspect, and then there's a practical thing that you do with that spiritual aspect. He takes these dreams, his understanding given by the Lord, and he does something. He stores up huge quantities of grain. He uses his power to prepare in response to what God has said. Like the grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. So all of a sudden now Egypt is a stockpile of grain because God has said in 7 years there's going to be a famine. And there was a famine. And just several verses later it says this: All the world comes to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Now, Joseph's not just dealing with his brothers. He's not just dealing with a couple co-prisoners. He's not even dealing with just one world leader. He's affecting the known world now. They have a stockpile of grain while everybody else is kind of caught off guard. It's a blessing to God. Joseph never forgets that it's God. And all throughout his speeches, whenever he goes to say something, he'll say something like, well, I can't help you, but I know somebody who can. I know God can help you. And he kind of puts his trust in God repeatedly. This week, some of you know my mom was hospitalized. She had major surgery to repair a previous surgery that went wrong. And it was just a miserable situation for her, and the surgery went all well. But I want to just speak to you about the moment before she went into surgery. I was in her room with her, and I was praying for her. And you got to ask, like, well, what are you going to pray for somebody? Like in a real situation like that, inside, she's been damaged. She's kind of frustrated, even angry about that. She's severely, like a huge trial in front of her, going into major kind of open abdominal surgery. And what do you pray into that situation? And I said, Mom, let's pray this. How about we pray, Jesus, I trust you. As I go into surgery, I trust you. It's just a great prayer. It's really faith. That's what our life is like. Where we keep getting into situations and we say, Jesus, I trust you. I put my trust in you. And that comes up in Joseph's life every time he talks. Almost every time he talks, it's something like that. He's like, well, listen, I can't exactly help you, but I trust God. And Pharaoh takes this guy and he makes him kind of Lord over all. He's the savior of Egypt, but he's also savior to other countries who come to him, including this kind of being birthed country of Israel. It's not even Israel yet. Israel is just a guy. Jacob gets named Israel by God in that kind of Bible thing that happens. And then this is going to be the name of this new people, Israel. And they go to Canaan. Actually, they go to Canaan when Israel, Jacob, says to his sons, why are you just standing here looking at each other? Egypt has grain. There's a famine. We got to go get grain. Why aren't you in Egypt now? That's what he says. Doesn't that sound like a dad thing to say? Like, what are you boys doing here? Go get us some grain, right? And so the 10 of them, the 10 brothers who are older than Joseph, the same ones that did the attack on Joseph, head off to Egypt to get some grain, and they take a lot of money so that they can pay for the grain. But Benjamin, Joseph's little brother, stays behind because Benjamin is Rachel's boy. And the only one of Rachel's two boys, Joseph and Benjamin, who are left behind for Joseph. And Rachel was the wife of his heart. The wife that he worked an extra 7 years for, the one he really loved. And that's why he favored Joseph so much. And so he keeps Benjamin back. They send the other groups here, the other brothers, to go get some grain. And while the whole world's coming to Egypt, so are the brothers of Joseph. They show up. Now, another thing I wanted to just show you about the maturity of Joseph is how soft he stayed towards his brothers. One of the themes that keeps coming up is his weeping. So, like, this guy is a world-class leader at this point. The brothers come in to meet him. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes him. He looks totally different now. He's shaved up like an Egyptian. He's clean. He's wealthy beyond measure. They're common shepherds, kind of hairy and dirty and smelly probably, right? And they come into his court. Maybe they clean up a little bit or whatever, but they are recognized by him. And it says he had to find a private place to weep. Here's another time when they bring Benjamin. This is just like a one of many verses that are like, there are several verses that are like that. Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. And he went into his private room and wept there. Another place, when he starts weeping so loudly that the Egyptians are like, what's up with Joseph? Like, what's the deal? The guy's like in his room, he's bawling. And it's because he's soft-hearted to his brothers. I want you to pay attention to that. Like I gotta kind of get on my bicycle here and go fast. But listen, what is that thing that after all those years, after all that abuse, after them trying to murder him, lying to their father about it, separating him away from the family, selling him into slavery, what is that thing that when Joseph sees them, he weeps? How did he keep his heart soft like that? What is it that he had for them? There's this whole other deal where he kind of accuses them of spy. Joseph does these like a series of little kind of grace tricks. Okay, so at one point he puts 9 of them in prison, sends one back to get Benjamin. He wants to see the younger brother. He says he thinks they're spies. He doesn't really think they're spies. He knows what's going on. But he's doing these things as they're going back. He puts silver in their bags, right? And then he switches it around. Now it's one person has to stay in prison and the other 9 brothers can go. He puts silver in it, and he keeps doing this thing that God does to us, like foretastes of blessing. And he puts the silver that they brought back in their bags. They get worried about it. He's like, he rejected our silver, but he's just blessing them. And there's like scene after scene before the big reveal. There's scene after scene that he is for them and not against them. And scene after scene where he goes into rooms and weeps. This goes on. They bring Benjamin back. Okay, so they go back and Jacob says, okay, they've got some grain with them. One of the brothers is in jail. The father sort of says, look, I can't risk sending Benjamin back. Joseph is trying to reunite the whole family and see his whole brother Benjamin. But Jacob can't bear the thought of Benjamin dying or him losing Benjamin after he lost Joseph. And he says, your brother is dead. And there's only one left. And if there's any harm that comes to Benjamin, you'll bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. Such great writing, right? You'll bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. And so he won't send Benjamin, but then the famine increases. They run out of the grain that they brought back. We got to send Benjamin back. And so there's this whole kind of talking Dad into it. And Dad finally relents, sends Benjamin along. And that's when we see this verse here, is when Benjamin's brought into the sight of Joseph here. And he just weeps at the sight of his brother. And all throughout this whole thing, they start to think the things that are bad that are happening to us, the way we're getting in trouble, the way this guy thinks we're spies, it's all because of what we did to Joseph those years ago. And the guilt is coming down on them. But there's also this like echo back from their guilt of grace coming to them, including one of the times when Joseph's servant says this, don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in the sacks. I have received your silver. And he brings all these guys into the house of Joseph here, and they bow down to the ground. And it's an interesting thing because as they bow down to the ground, then they're actually fulfilling that dream, right? The dream that Joseph had in the first place. And by the way, if you stifle somebody's dreams, you will not stifle the actual thing that God meant by those dreams. You might make somebody feel heartbroken, or maybe somebody's made you feel heartbroken about the thing that God wants to work in you, but God's not stifled by that. And here all the brothers come in, and they bow down in front of him, and they fulfill that dream. And then Joseph is deeply moved by the sight of Benjamin. He goes out into his private room, and he weeps there. And then as another one of these little foretastes of grace, they have a big dinner, and they have this dinner, and Joseph, I just think Joseph's got like this little kind of sick sense of humor, right? He puts them at the table in the birth order of their life, and so the guys are like sitting at the table, and he goes like, do you notice like we're like all in order here, and like how does that happen? It's like a little foretaste that there's something else going on. They still don't recognize this Egyptian ruler who's being kind of kind to them and sort of moving this story along. And then they're sent back to Canaan with all this grain and all their silver. They've got more silver than when they came back. And Joseph works out this crazy thing where he puts his cup in with Benjamin. So it's kind of, what do they call it when the cops kind of plan a thing? And it's like, what's it called, right? Yeah, setup, but that's not it. You know, huh? Nope. There's definitely a thing. This is like everybody participate. What is it?
Bait and switch.
Nope. Entrapment. He puts a cup in Benjamin's bag, and then he sends his like kind of royal police after to get Benjamin. Checking his bag, there's a royal cup in there, and arrest Benjamin. So Benjamin comes back, and then the brothers are freaking out. They all have to come back and they explain. They come back, and there's all this explaining going on, and then it says Joseph can't bear it anymore, and he reveals himself to his brothers. says, it's me, it's Joseph. Of course, they're freaking out, like, we tried to kill this guy. We sold him into slavery. But Joseph's heart's still soft towards his brothers. And he's got this kind of moral upper hand then. He's got this, like, right to squash these guys, to do anything. They fear that. They're sure, like, oh my gosh, it's the worst person in the world for this to be. But he's weeping. He's weeping so loudly the Egyptians can hear him. And then he goes and he uses this moral upper hand. There will be times in your life when you have the total advantage, every reason to say, aha! But if you've been with God, you might know there's something better to say than that. And Joseph knows what to say. His brothers saw that their father was dead. This is a little bit later in verse 50, in chapter 50, when dad dies. And there's this, now the one thing that might be their kind of the roadblock between Joseph and their death. Dad is dead. What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph, your father left these instructions before he died, which who knows whether he actually did. But they said, these guys will lie to get out of any trouble. They do it again and again and again, right? Your father left these instructions before he did. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they've committed in treating you so badly. So now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God your father. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept, of course, crybaby, right? And his brothers then came in. They threw themselves down. Again, the vision coming true, the dream coming true. They threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But listen to grace come out of the mouth of somebody who's kept his eyes on the Lord the whole entire time. There's some other thing you can do than just be sucked into the poison of this world. Joseph says to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I'll provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to you. God gives you power sometimes and authority. He can put you in a place where you could just bring revenge. You could hold something against somebody in your family for years and years and years and imprison them, enslave them to yourself. But because he stayed close to God, really, that's his real big trick here, is that he kept his eyes on God's intention. Look at this in the middle of that passage I just read. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended. Somehow out of this whole deal, out of going to thrown in a pit, lied about, separated from his father, sold into slavery, lied about and accused falsely in slavery, thrown into prison, forgotten in prison, brought out of prison, now ruling in Egypt all these years, somehow Joseph kept his eyes on the intentions of God. And I don't have an easy answer for how do you keep your eyes on God. I mean, certainly paying attention to God and being open to God is part of that. But if there's a way that you could keep your eyes on God, that you could grow strong even though you suffered in your life, even though you had a rough start, even though your teen years were brutal and your family was broken, there's a way that you could keep your eyes on God so that you could be that when it comes time, when all the things have worked around, so that you could be a kind of an embodiment of Christ-like maturity in whatever relationship you are. Wouldn't you want that? What if you were the kind of person who says, no matter what, I never want to lose track of what God is doing in this whole thing. Lord, build up in me a kind of relational maturity that would make me an asset to my family, and an asset to my workplace, and an asset to my church, an asset to my community, and ultimately, if it were to rise to this level, an asset to the entire world. Mature me in my life. None of us will probably have a life as bad as Joseph's, and none of us will probably rise as high as Joseph. But if we just said, whatever you've done in my life, Lord, would you teach me in it so that I would grow in maturity and have something to share with others? And that's what Joseph did. Apparently through that whole thing, he stayed soft to his family. He used what a power he had gained to solve the problems of others, and he forgave his family by keeping God's intentions in his heart. I want to give you a couple things to try as we walk away from this. One, I would just say this. If you're in your teens, seek God. Dream big. Dream big. Say, God, give me dreams. God, show me what you've got for my life. God, I want to live the full life that you have for me. And I'm surrounded by people maybe who don't celebrate that exact same thing, but in my teens, give me a vision that I could pursue. How I wish that the things I thought when I was like 13, 14 on a retreat where I said, oh, I give everything to God, and then I just flew away from that. How I wish I'd pursued that from that day. I would have saved so much grief to my heart and to other people's, right? And I would say this, use your 20s to mature. You're not going to have smooth sailing throughout your 20s. There's going to be a lot of lessons that come at you, good and bad. But use them to get to that time when God says, okay, it's go time, bud, that you're ready. Use your time in your 20s. Resist what the enemy wants to do to distract you off of it. That's the story. When it came time, when Pharaoh needed an interpretation, Joseph was ready because he had cooperated with God in all those unseen years. And I would say specifically, ask God for dreams with meaning. God still speaks to men and women through their dreams, and sometimes our awake hours are too busy, and he'll just say, I'll come to you while you're asleep. And most of your dreams aren't going to be from God, no matter how creative they are, because we've got amazing little story makers in our brains for dreams. Totally amazing. But I do believe God still speaks to people with dreams. And ask him. Don't be afraid as you're laying your head on your pillow tonight. Say, God, would you give me a dream from you? And ask God about his intentions for your suffering. Okay, God, I'm going through this. I'm not Joseph. It's not in the Bible. This is my real life. What do you want to do in this story? And then use your words to encourage your family. You are a source of strength for your family. Use your words to encourage them. And then use whatever authority and power you have to save the world. We are the conduit through which God works in this world. And he's trying to do similar things now through our church and through you that he did in Joseph's day. Why don't you stand up? We'll pray together.